Headcount Experts, 26, first episode. I guess it would be technically 10 if we wanted to have round numbers. So we're counting up from 10 this year. But we've really spent all of January putting some thought into how we're going to go about doing this. I'm pretty excited about what's to come this year. So welcome back. How was the holiday?
It was great. Yeah, I had a blast. It's definitely not as relaxing with two young kids running around. Two.
Oh, two. All right. I was about to say,
Not a
when did you
toddler
add
yet.
one?
An elderly dog who's starting to have medical issues, but
Yeah.
no, it's good. Nice to have some downtime, spend some time with the family, but also really excited to be back. I know there's a lot going on this year, and I'm really excited by the plan that we put together, and I think it's going to create a lot of value for everyone.
Excellent. Yeah. I mean, this is the point of the first couple of episodes was to just prove that you and I could do it. And then now that we've kind of found our groove, it's really just structuring things in a way that's a lot more consumable. Today's no exception. We're kicking off with the way you kick off a hiring plan. So between Chris and I, we've kicked off probably 100 to 150 together, either as consultants or internally. And so these are the 5 best practices that we found kind of, if you draw a line between all of them, what are the best companies doing? And so, I always start off like, what's the best? What's the worst? Like in a minute or two, like what's the best and the worst kickoff you've ever had? And why was it so good or so bad?
Yeah, I think probably going back a long way, and I won't name any companies or individuals, but I think some of the worst experiences I've had was one where we kicked off hiring with hundreds and hundreds of recs, but no real plan to actually integrate those recs into the organization, no real plan for actually sequencing as to how we're going to actually kind of load those recs throughout the year. It was just January 1st, 500 recs drop into the ATS and complete chaos. That was actually my first year in the talent organization. And so I thought that was the way that things were done. It wasn't until much later I realized there was so much more we could have done to make that year successful. Um, Absolute chaos.
That was the
What a good
worst.
experience to go through.
What was the best? What made something great? Like how'd you refine the process? Could be a customer, could be someone you worked at, but like what was the best one?
Yeah, I think the first time I actually introduced some more kind of operational theory into the planning process. So actually, instead of just asking what is needed and then figuring out how to deliver it, actually being part of the conversation, actually planning ahead. Okay, what are you trying to achieve next year? What does the talent look like that you need to achieve that? How are you currently structured? Where are your gaps? And actually, kind of building more of a plan in collaboration with the hiring managers and then the executive leader who's going to sponsor that hiring plan, and actually coming up with a plan that everyone could work off. And then that worked incredibly well. One of the reasons that we kind of implemented that approach was to actually grow talent internally as well. And so what you then started to do, instead of saying, okay, we need these 50 recs prioritized in Q1, it was, okay, over the course of the year, this is how we want the organization to look. These are the hires that we need to make. These are the internal moves that we want to make. And actually, we're going to stop hiring at this level because we found that we're over hiring and we're actually preventing people from moving up. So it's not just how many people do you hire? What does the organization look like? But actually, how do you think about internal mobility and development of existing talent so you don't lose great people and you create this kind of more kind of coherent pattern? And then that was a really good experience. It kind of hits everything that I enjoy doing,
Yeah.
and it actually delivered amazing success for the team as well, who had historically struggled to hire and retain great people.
Sounds like both of them contributed to your development of the people supply chain, which as Chris and I were planning the content for this year, you'll see that as a consistent theme throughout. And I'm excited to kind of talk about that, not only throughout the year, but in context about kicking off a headcount plan. And so, I've had some best and worst myself. The worst was no alignment with finance. We had an FP&A person who was unfortunately using recruiting as savings. And so when Rex did drop, we never got enough capacity so that they could have the savings and build up a good financial position. And I was too junior in my career to realize what was happening or why it was happening. And so that was number one. That was the worst one. The best one was when I started actually perfecting a capacity demand forecast and being able to use it as a tool to articulate what's possible without it being like work harder, try harder, do more. But there are kind of limits and things that I think bring you and I together with the way that I approach it, the way that you approach it with the people supply chain. And so those are the kind of things that we're going to talk about today. But we have 5 things. I think just top to bottom, right? Managing recruiting capacity versus demand, right? You get your hiring plan. The first thing you want to do, build a capacity demand forecast. You want to calculate the capacity of the hiring teams to meet the demand with you. You want to prioritize recs with your leaders and the business. And you want to build a recruiting cadence for how do you do your recruiting with that manager? What data do they need to see? When do they need to see it? What warning flag should you be bringing to the table for them? And then lastly, build a good process. And that could be everything from how do we kick off a requisition to what's required to start recruiting and how do we make an offer. And so those are the things that we're going to be covering today. Did I miss anything? Anything on top of mind for you as far as like prepping a good kickoff, or should we get right into it?
Yeah, I think just the visualization of what you're trying to achieve over the course of the year, but the reality of actually how does that talent flow? Go back to the supply chain analogy. How does that talent flow into the organization? What outflows are you expected with attrition? And then what constraints are you going to have? So I think learning those up front is going to make these 5 points much easier to actually navigate through and create a really successful hiring plan.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, kicking off a hiring plan is a kind of segmented part of what total workforce planning is. And we're operating under the assumption that there is a built in plan for what your attrition forecast would look like. And, you're considering the different kind of operational triggers for how headcount might change if you close a new deal or open a new location or fundraise, right? So there's a bigger context that all this sits within. But you're a recruiting leader, you're a finance leader, you're an executive, you just got your hiring plan. It's the beginning of 2026 for a lot of companies, and that means the beginning of their fiscal year, the beginning of the hiring plan. What do you do? And so that's what we're going to cover today. And then we'll figure out kind of like what does everyone get from it? So you do these things. What's the point? What do you get? How is it different? And there's some short-term things and there's some long-term things. So the short-term things are obviously what makes your life better today. If you do these practices year over year, you're going to create a better data set for the future. So we're trying a new thing. This podcast is called Technical Corner. It's a segment where we try to show you some of the tools that we use live on the podcast. And so today's no different. I'm going to do my best to pull this up while we're live. For those of you who don't know, I run Unicorn Talent. It's a community for recruiting leaders. And it is a way for me to distribute some of the tools that have worked as a community so that everyone has access. This is one of those things among about 20 other things. Chris has a headcount tracker up there. Michael Brown has a guide to creating some AI tools within a recruiting organization. A lot of TA leaders are sharing kind of the tools that they use. And so this is one of mine. It's called a capacity demand forecast. And essentially, this is how I've kicked off every hiring plan is with this capacity demand forecast. And so what you'll see, let me see if I could fit it in the screen. There we go. Is I'm taking my recruiter capacity, which is offer accepts per month, and I am mapping it against the offers that are expected for a given month based on the hiring plan. So the way this works is you upload your hiring plan into the tool and you can select a target fill month. Now, spreadsheets have their gaps. It's part of the reason why I created Headcount 365. It has a more advanced capacity demand forecast within that predicts hire date, that really predicts whether or not you're going to fill something on time. But what we're doing with this plan is we're saying, what are the roles that we're asking for? When do we expect to fill it? And we're mapping it against the recruiting capacity that we have. And as you adjust your recruiting capacity up or down, you're able to see kind of how it impacts your ability to fill roles and whether or not you might run into a month where you either need to distribute recs across recruiters or maybe get a temporary recruiter. And this is kind of a snapshot tool for folks to then be able to go in and kind of build their plan with the business. Hey, you've given me this hiring plan and you've asked me to do some stuff. And here's my plan against it. Very raw, but at the same time, a very powerful visualization for recruiting leaders to then bring back to the business a plan that's similar to the sales process. And so I'll put a link to that in the description below or in the YouTube description or whatever, so that you could take a look at it. It's completely free. It comes with a Slack community if you want to join. Chris and I are in there if you ever need help with anything. this is how I've kind of kicked off my plan. And there's two main things that it helps me do. One, advocate for recruiting staff and the distribution of the workload. And two, manage the expectations of the leaders. But what's your reaction? What's your gut reaction when you see a capacity demand forecast like that? I know you and I have done some pretty complex things, and that's relatively simple. But what do you like? Where are the gaps? What do you do on top of it? Give me your gut reaction to that
Yeah, I
forecast.
think I've created a lot of different models, a lot of different spreadsheets, dashboards, everything over the course of my career. And I'd say by far the best approach is creating a very simple model that gives you that red and green output that you can actually sit with your stakeholder and actually edit together. When you start doing very complex models, they're incredibly valuable for planning by yourself or within the analytics team. But if you're actually just sitting down with the head of sales or the head of customer success and trying to explain to them the expected sequencing of hires over the course of the year, they're going to respond much better to, oh, well, if I just change this and this and this is what it means over the course of the kind of planning cycle. And it actually helps to get buy-in much quicker. So I really like how, you've laid it out. It makes sense. It actually looks like a revenue forecast or an S&OP forecast that people in the business are going to be used to seeing, but it's in a format that people understand. Bringing in that, supply chain, that business process to recruiting is incredibly valuable. It's also from my experience with the content I've created, the most in-demand content seems to be for this. How do I actually create a planning process that's going to give me credibility with the business? And that template does it instantly. I have a couple of templates. I actually have a very in-depth recruiting capacity planning course that a few people have taken. But I think getting that template, learning how to do it, and being comfortable doing it live in front of other people is incredibly valuable.
Yeah. We'll put a link to the template and course that you have as well, just so that folks can see both sides. And maybe in a future pod, we kind of take a deep dive into your stuff. But right when you first started responding, you mentioned something that kind of like triggered in my brain. It's like, this is at the beginning of the year, the hiring plan drops. And for the recruiting team or maybe the finance team, this might be one of the bigger things. For the sales exec, for the ops exec, for the product exec, this is one of 10 things that just got put on their plate. They're setting their goals, they're planning for their customers, they're looking at things where how important is recruiting really? Now, I know recruiting teams will argue that it is the most important thing because it powers the business. And to some degree, that is true. In the moment of operating with these folks, there might be something more burning in that moment that you have to be able to articulate the points you're trying to make and the reason why you're trying to make these points and the value of doing so to this person. Because not only will it help their plan, it will allow them to interact with you in a way that's not so reactive and not so one dimensional. And what I mean by that is like the amount of times that I've come to an executive before I really learned how to do capacity demand well, they would just be like, just more at the top of funnel. Like, I need five, you've given me three, so just more at the top. And it's not the way that it does work. It doesn't not work, but improving conversion and talking about timing and looking at your capacity, there are just smarter ways to go about it where, back when Joe Atkinson was doing Purple, he calls this the difference between being a recruiter and a talent partner. And this is kind of the partnership aspect of it. And so, best practice number one, map recruiting capacity against demand, and it will give you an idea of what's possible. It will allow you to shape your expectations with your executive team. It might even let you advocate for more recruiters. And when you start to get really good at capacity demand forecasting, you can start to bring in that attrition model and show future hires that aren't on the plan yet. You can associate revenue or production with these hires, and you can start to say, here's what the gap in recruiting capacity will cost and what I intend to do with it, which is a good flow into the next best practice, which is calculating the hiring manager's capacity to do the interviews or to hire the people that the business wants. And so hiring manager participation is a big trigger to pull for the improvement of recruiting capacity. I have a design like, in the future on Unicorn. I'm going to either build it or vibe code it or whatever. I want to build like an interview hours calculator, but the concept is very simple. I'm a engineering department. I need to 10x the size of my engineering team. I have 3 engineers on the team now. Who's doing all the interviewing and how are they doing that without sacrificing the production of their own of their own works. That's kind of like the biggest thing for me is setting expectations with the hiring manager. So it's not just solely, the burden doesn't solely rest on me, but how do you go about managing the distribution of work between the recruiting part of the process and the business part of the process? Like what tactics have you done to kind of either one, drive awareness or two, drive action by building a plan to solve that type of stuff?
Yeah, so I think this stage two builds on top of that recruiting capacity plan. So, we've got this high level model. This is how many hires we need. This is the capacity that the recruiting team has. Next, you're talking about, okay, how much time is going to be needed on the business side in order to make this plan work. And so what you can actually start to do is kind of like pull out the number of hires that need to be made per month and then kind of back into that with a reverse funnel of, okay, how many interviews need to happen in order to get that number of hires? And then how much time per interview is going to be needed? And so you can actually, there's two ways of doing it. You kind of do the bottoms up. Okay, this is how many hours we need from you in order to deliver against this hiring goal that we've set. We can do it from a recruiting standpoint, but we need the business capacity as well. Maybe that's 10 or 20 or 30 hours of interviewing time per week. And that's going to be a big constraint on the business side of it. Especially you gave the engineering example. Maybe engineers have to work 4 days a week with 1 day a week dedicated solely to interviewing. And we actually used to do this pretty consistently during a busy MBA hiring seasons, where we had the MBA cohort that was hired in the last 5 years, giving the interviews for the new MBAs that were coming in. And for those kind of blocks during the season, we would block out the whole Friday so that they could actually dedicate the time. They weren't going to get pulled away. We got buy-in from the senior leadership, so we had to do that. So that's the kind of the bottoms up approach. This is what we need. Commit to this, and we'll deliver against your target. The other way is the top down approach. We say, okay, you've set this hiring goal. How much time are you willing to allocate from your team in order to deliver against that goal? And then you get a budget for how many hours are needed. And from that budget, you can estimate how many interviews are going to be delivered. So let's say you have a 45-minute interview, a 15-minute kind of debrief for filling in the scorecards, which is often forgotten about. An hour per interview. Let's say that you need to deliver 100 interviews a week and you have 10 people on the team who are equipped to actually interview and trusted the key is making sure they're trusted to actually give objective, critical feedback on each candidate. That means each of those 10 people is going to have to dedicate 10 hours a week to interviewing. So it's back to this, are people willing to give 1 day a week solely to interviewing? And if you can't kind of like bridge the gap, you're going to come up with that constraint, and that's where the discussion starts between: do we want to actually pull back on our hiring assumptions, or sequence it in a way that maybe during a lull in the business year, we prioritize hiring for this team, and for the rest of the year, we're going to prioritize hiring elsewhere. So it goes from this linear model of, each month we're going to, deliver this many recs, and we're going to have this much hiring activity, to, okay, in the spring, we're going to focus on campus hiring because we've got kind of last minute campus hires coming in for entry level. Over the summer, things are quieter on the sales side. And so we're going to actually do all of our sales hiring over the summer. Then in the fall, maybe it switches to another type of role. So you kind of have these waves of hiring.
Right.
And actually, that allows you
This
as a TA leader to actually plan capacity and maybe move people around, where you have this agile workforce that is going to kind of keep you on top of things. So it kind of brings more reality to the planning process, instead of just realizing when you get to April 1st and all of a sudden you have these kind of Q2 conferences for all the sales reps and no one can run any interviews. And you have all these candidates in the pipeline that now have to wait for 3 months
right.
before you have to get an on-site. And what
You
happens there?
actually
Everyone gets snapped up.
actually kind of low key gave a plug for like the meta views and the bright hires of the world, right? If you're associating 15 minutes of scorecard and you're trying to go as a recruiter, get meta view or bright hire to like figure out to like streamline your interview operations, now you have a cost and a value to doing so. So free plug for those folks. And the other thing that you touched upon that kind of like brought it back to the people supply chain for me is like, this is identifying the constraints, right? So if you have enough recruiting capacity, you build your capacity demand forecast, everything's green, but you don't have the interview capacity, you're kind of identifying your constraint, right? Like, is that a fair statement?
Exactly. Yeah. So, recruiting's not a black box that you kind of throw recs in, you get hires out. There are all these kind of constraints, and some are on the recruiting side, some are on the business side. And so, really identifying those constraints up front is going to allow you to plan more successfully. And so, as you're doing this kind of flow of talent planning over the course of the year, you have all these constraints. And so, you're maybe hitting maximum recruiting capacity for a certain team. And it's not based on the number of recruiters, it's based on the number of hours that the interviewers are available to actually do the recruiting. And so you want to kind of forecast back before then. You don't want to load the funnel up too much because then you're going to give a terrible experience when candidates get to the bottom of the funnel and there's just no space for them to interview. And then beyond that, you kind of have the onboarding flow. So you're kind of like taking all these constraints and starting to build something that's a little bit more realistic and agile.
Right. And like, we're not going to get too deep into the candidate funnel here, but if we're starting to identify constraints, right? You have the ability of the recruiting team to produce hires and the demand of the business requesting hires. That's your supply demand curve. You'll obviously have the constraint of funnel, which is now impacted as I hear on LinkedIn. I haven't gotten, and this might be a good guest for, a future topic, but interview fraud. I'm interested to know how top of funnel volume has been impacting businesses. So that might impact your capacity in one way, regardless, right? So you're going to have these different constraints, whether it's a supply or a demand constraint. And brings us directly into like our third best practice, which is establishing prioritization guidelines. So I know every recruiting team that I've worked with has some sort of like high priority, medium, low priority. No one is ever going to write low priority, I don't think, on something that's totally active. But the idea that everyone agrees on what a priority is, and there's a unified idea of the limits of prioritization. I think that's kind of that's my perspective. But before I go too deep on, deep thoughts with Eric, how did you use prioritization? What have you seen work? What have you seen break? How does prioritization work in the businesses that you serve or that you've worked for?
Yeah, I think there's the prioritization from the hiring manager, which is always going to be everything is P0, and then there's the prioritization that actually the senior leaders want to think through. So, there could be new product lines that they're expanding into, and in which case they actually want to prioritize the kind of sequencing to launch that product line. So maybe they start off with the R&D team to actually get the product to market, then it's product marketing, then it's sales, then it's post sales, and then it's kind of ongoing professional services or whatever. So there's kind of like that way of doing prioritization where, kind of upfront, there's certain activities that need to happen. And you're kind of doing concurrent activity then where while the product marketing team is building all the materials to sell, you're actually hiring the sales reps to actually sell the material once conference season starts. And then you're hiring post-sales support while those sales reps are actually in process. You don't need everyone in place all up front. And so that's the kind of like new product line or new growth strategy kind of hiring plan. There's then the kind of the other hiring plan of actually how do you build a team or how do you potentially replace underperformers across a team? And maybe before you kind of like build the kind of the actual kind of core face workforce of the team, you actually want to bring in a new leader to the organization, or you're going to promote someone and you need to backfill that position first. Quite a lot of the time, these roles are more confidential. And so this is where a really strong relationship between TA and the head of that business unit is going to be really important, because then you can start to sequence and it's going to take, 6 or 9 months to hire a director in order to build the team around them. And it's only going to take maybe 2 or 3 months to hire more of the kind of entry level frontline roles. You're actually going to have to sequence that, and that's going to throw off all of your calculations because you can't start hiring those junior roles until the director's in place, because they're actually going to want to be on the panel. And so it's the way I used to liken it to is if you had a series of buckets and you have to fill the buckets up, like what order do you want to do them? Some of the buckets are going to be quite big and some of them are going to be quite small. And the water that you're pouring into the buckets is your capacity. And so if you want to actually hire the kind of more senior folks first, you have this big bucket, you've got to put all of your water in that bucket before you start filling the smaller buckets. Or you could sprinkle a bit over each one, but in that case, your smaller buckets are going to fill up very quickly, and then your big buckets are still going to have a long way to go. And so you're going to wind up with this org design structure that's kind of completely misshapen. And that's where problems start to occur.
We're going to get into recruiter incentives, I presume, in a future episode where, it's easy to hit the volume numbers with the roles that might not be as critical to the business, but that's for a future episode. I would say, my take on prioritization. So I built a high priority module into Headcount 365 to include some of these things because I've been so passionate about the abuse of what prioritization is inside of most companies. There's a few best practices. I should have counted them but we're rattling off here. So there's a few best practices that I find have delivered great prioritization utilization across different companies. One is having conditions around what makes a priority. So start date, for example, a backfill, they should have started yesterday, someone with a near-term start date within the recruiting time, or a future start date that's like well beyond the time it would take a recruiting person to fill it. So there's a date consideration. There can also be a revenue consideration, like how productive is this person for the underlying revenue? There's also a production aspect as well. But the idea, it's like, how soon do we need them and how does their work impact whatever the goals are of the business, right? It's just kind of a prioritization condition. So that's number one. Number two is a limit to the number of roles that can be P0 or the highest priority. And what I mean by that is if everything's a priority, nothing is. And so the business needs to be able to kind of narrow it down, whether it's by recruiter, recruiting pod, or as a business overall. Everything can't be a priority, right? So that's the second thing. The third thing is independent reporting of prioritization. So how did we do against the priorities that we've set? Did we fill them on time? What was the funnel volume looking like? How was the hiring manager participation? And by segmenting reporting on P0, this is like the business putting its best foot forward. So if your numbers aren't great there, you got work to do elsewhere in the business. And the last thing is the context for hiring managers about how do you create a high priority within your business. So if you don't have good rules set by the business, they're just going to interpret high priority for in their own lens. So like if they have a role that has a near term start date and impacts revenue, but you just had a big executive departure and you have a lot of sales roles to hire or whatever, you have to draw the line between that person being like, but I have this very important role. How come it's not being prioritized? And then the last thing I would say is giving managers the ability to self-serve if they feel like there's a gap between prioritization and the recruiting capacity that you have. And so when a manager can review applications in the ATS without disrupting a process and kind of move them to a short list, if they can source on their own and add prospects to something that a recruiter can go look at, if they can organize interviews on their own, then it's kind of a way for you to give them the ability to self-serve without them having that negative feeling towards recruitment. So that's kind of, off the top of my head, the things that I think of working very well between the prioritization utilization. And it's such a contentious topic because like you said, like everything's an open role means I can do more. And I'm, a business leader who gets rated on how much I do. So if I don't get this person, I might not do as well. And you're directly impacting their performance. And executives don't get to be executives by thinking they're not a priority. So it's a dance.
Maybe
What's
building on that point a little bit is I remember doing some deep analysis on recruiting, not efficiency but productivity really, like how much time were recruiters actually spending doing the job of recruiting. And it's in some areas it was down to 35%. So you create this capacity model and you expect 40 hours a week of recruiting output, and you actually only get in like 10 or 15 hours a week. It's going to have a huge impact. And one of the primary reasons for that were hiring managers constantly bombarding them with questions, and it all came down to they wanted to get their recs prioritized. So I actually think up front, understanding who's got the ability to reprioritize recs, and depending on the size of the organization, that could be the CEO. Kind of worked with an organization like a few thousand people, but the CEO wanted to be the one to approve any new recs that were not on the plan so that they could actually manage the workflow. And that way the recruiters weren't being bombarded with, where's my role? Why isn't this prioritized? Why am I seeing candidates? It was kind of like top down. This is what we need to do in order to deliver a sustainable headcount plan for the year. So we don't get to the point where we've hired too many people in the wrong areas and we have to go through a reduction in force. And so I think clearing that up front is going to provide a lot more capacity for the team downstream. And if you don't do it, then the recruiters are just going to be bombarded, and you actually might lose your best ones because they don't want to work in an environment where they don't have the ability to actually do the job they've been hired to do.
Yeah, I think a core development component of a recruiting leader is upward management. And one of the key like we'll get into this later on, but one of the key aspects is the ability to manage something like priority and come away being liked or respected because the approach is not can't do it or we don't have enough. It's a system of here's the way we define priority. This is the expectations. This is my commitment to priority roles and a report about how I perform against it. It's now a conversation. And I think it's just a good exercise for any recruiter to manage. The most junior recruiters are serving more than one hiring client and have to manage between them. So it's just a good way to develop your career. But you actually segued into the fourth best practice for kicking off a hiring plan, which is setting the cadence by which you, as someone fulfilling that hiring plan, interacts with the business. And this could be a finance person, this could be a recruiting person, but you need to do, in my opinion, three things, right? What is the expectation for the information you need to see? So, what information and when? What is the escalation path? Should I identify any issues? And what warning flags do you want to participate in? Am I missing anything? Like, I know that there's more to it, but that's kind of the way that I group my expectations management. Yeah, my expectations management. What did I miss? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I mean, the key here is transparency and over communicating what's happening, and this kind of it defeats that issue of constantly getting bombarded with questions or spending so much time actually creating analyses and not actually doing the recruiting. So you're reporting that we're not on target, but you're actually not able to do the work that requires you to get back on target because you're spending too much time communicating that you're not on target. So having these expectations up front, agreed with the business on how frequently you're going to report, what are you going to report, what is important, so that you can actually get on with the job, but not leave people kind of question whether their activities actually being prioritized in the right way. So I think it's going to be unique for each organization, but I think the key points that you called out are have to be there up front so that everyone feels like they've got the right information. The way I like to think about it is you kind of have, different levels of depth depending on the frequency. And as long as you're drip feeding people information, they're generally happy. And so one of the approaches I found, and I'm curious to get your take as well, is there's kind of like three different reporting layers. There's kind of a weekly, a monthly, and a quarterly. And so weekly is really a snapshot of what's happening across the funnels. How many interviews did we deliver this week? How many hires did we close? It's kind of all the important metrics, but actually not in isolation. You actually want to compare that to the plan. So we started off in, step one is create the plan. Are we actually living up to the plan? And you can create burn down charts and everything else. I don't like those for a weekly reporting. For a weekly, it's, a simple table of, we were supposed to deliver 50 interviews this week. We delivered 40. And the reason why we failed was because the sales team were at a conference. And so we had to delay all the interviews for next week. But we've doubled the capacity of interviews next week. So we stay on track for the month. And so that kind of like quick update. So used to run these reports pretty frequently, both in supply chain and on the talent side. And they're incredibly helpful because they can not just kickstart conversations, especially because these can go up to very senior leaders and they can, very quickly at a glance, understand exactly what's happening in the business and kind of forecast when issues are about to arise. Go ahead. Any thoughts
No,
on
no,
them?
I was going to say, I totally agree with the idea of having set reporting for what's happening today and then a retrospective of what has happened over the course of many todays. I just think, when you're setting this reporting cadence, right? Like you've just received your hiring plan, you know which managers you're serving, whether you're an FP&A business partner or recruiting business partner, right? You have to go to those folks and say, what do you do every week that my job impacts? And how do you want your weekly reporting set up? And then what information do you need to report to the business during your QBR or some other reporting, board reporting, shareholder reporting, whatever, that I can then give you this information. And those managers are going to tell you, like, I've seen hundreds of individual recruiter weekly updates, and there's a couple of flaws. One, they could be a pain in the ass to get set up because the data is all over the place. Headcount 365 plug. But they also are, as a recruiting leader or as a finance leader, especially on the business partner side, your work, you're not, to some degree, you're advertising how you're doing. I think you want to make sure your hiring manager NPS scores are up, but you're enabling them to use this information elsewhere. And so I see a lot of conflation of like, hey, here's how good of a job I did. And the manager just doesn't, he's like, great. I didn't get the hires though. Good job. I don't care. So here's what I need. And so this reporting cadence of like, what do you need to do your job, and approaching it as I am an enabler of your business reporting, and I will get promoted, or I will have good feedback or good NPS scores if the information I provide you, you're able to use in action. And so, when I look at reporting escalation paths and warning flags, I'm saying the warning flags are like, you tell me what you want to know about if I think something's going bad. What do you want to know on every different cadence, and how does that impact your job? And then how do you want to handle stuff that's not going well, right? Like if I don't have enough recruiting capacity to meet your demand, do you want to partner with me on it, or do you want me to tell you? Do you want me to handle the recruiting? Right? It's like that's what I'm approaching a manager. I'm setting my cadence. I'm saying like, hey, we have this to do together, and I do the supply part, you do the demand part. How do you want this information? And setting that cadence will. If every recruiter sets the cadence, so you and I have worked at bigger teams, there could be 100 recruiters there. You're going to get a kind of bell curve of the simplest reporting to the most complex. And then you can enable an operations or enablement team, or you could advocate for an enablement person to produce this reports as a leader. So that's, in the world of capacity versus demand, this is essentially reporting cadence demand versus our capacity to produce it. And then you're kind of setting those expectations. And I'm sure you have war stories of like a manager wants essentially a annual retrospective every week. And you're like, if I don't set expectations and have my own internal recruiting team escalation path about whether or not that's possible, I'm just setting myself up for failure. And that's kind of like the main, kicking off the plan. If you don't do that as an individual or as a business, you're going to be in a tough spot when it comes to managing your hiring manager NPS,
And
at
I,
least in
I
my
think
case.
it's important to call that out because a lot of these managers are probably managing analysts or teams of analysts who do this kind of work day in, day out. But the recruiter is not there to do the deep analysis. They're there to get the hires. They should know how to read a funnel. They should know how to interpret the data that's coming through. But I think to your point, as soon as you start building these custom reports, and if you have 10 different hiring managers, you're creating 10 different reports each week. If each one takes you an hour, that's 10 hours of recruiting that you're not able to do. One of the things I really advocate for is a standardized, templatized report that a recruiter can pull, ideally from the ATS or from a Headcount 365 or system similar, where um, in 5 minutes they get all the data they need. They can send that report as a PDF or a hyperlink to the hiring manager with a couple of notes on comments on the data. The hiring manager can then interpret it, so they're not having to do the interpretation themselves and then translate to the hiring manager and kind of getting stuck in the middle and answering a bunch of questions. They're actually spending an hour or two a week delivering all of their analyses, and it's going to help them to diagnose their funnel as well. It's not just a reporting exercise. It's actually it's a good professional exercise for recruiters to do. But it frees up so much more additional recruiting capacity to actually close the roles and do the job that they need to do.
Yeah, I have this article that I wrote called Recruiting Capacity Like a Pro, and it has this triangle. I don't know how many photographers listen, but the idea that you have 100 points of work and you can distribute them between production, experience, reporting, process, right? You have to pick what you do. And a recruiter doing reporting is not a recruiter doing first round phone screens or sorting through your funnel. So, excuse me. So I think like one of the most important things, what we're concluding the reporting cadence kind of area is, in my opinion, recruiting teams, well, let's call them like business services, get analysts the least, right? It's analysts and enablement. So sales is one of the first because it generates revenue, and recruiting. What you're doing in this exercise is you're saying, what does the business need to operate better? And the proof point that if you produce good information for a leader about recruiting, they'll be able to hit revenue or production targets more. You might unlock an analyst or an enablement person coming from that business. Similar to how FP&A business partners grow their business. If you're having budget conversations, especially in your volume of production roles, and you need to be managing like predictive backfills for volume attrition, the finance team is going to help you get that information so that you can make the right call on those types of things. And so the reporting cadence allows you to unlock enablement roles. It also allows you to set expectations with the business, call out performers who might want too much or too little, and it allows you to standardize or automate using systems or people the ability of the team to get the information from the recruiting or finance team that's needed to better the business, right? So set your reporting cadence at the beginning of a hiring plan. This will allow you to just start the year off about what's possible. And you can then have you can almost have your own product roadmap from recruiting about reporting that's going to come out for those who have like higher demands. But yeah, essentially that's kind of one part of what we ask of hiring managers. The next and kind of the fifth best practice of kicking off a hiring plan is unifying what's needed to kick off a requisition. And this is another unicorn talent plug: intake sessions, interview rubrics, job descriptions, process cadence. You need to, for every role, have an idea of what it's going to take for you to start recruiting on that role so that you can drive accountability for things that you're not getting for the business. I have a bunch of thoughts about why to do this, but before I dive into them, what's your process for requisition kickoff? Like, what do you require from the business? How much time does it require? What's an escalation path if you're not getting anything? Like, how do you validate the data that you get? Kind of give me your thoughts on requisition kickoffs, and has that impacted your ability to fill a hiring plan either internally or at one of your customers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of the structured hiring process, and I've had many arguments over which is best because it some people see it as too restrictive, but I actually think having a kind of like a clean linear plan that you can follow to kick off a rec, everything's going to get chaotic beyond that, but setting up the kind of clear expectations up front, I think everything we've talked about at a hiring plan level, but for an individual rec, who's going to be responsible for what? When do we expect to have the first interviews? How many interviews do we expect to need before we're actually going to close this candidate? What is the job spec? How do we turn that into a job description? Where are we going to promote that? Who's going to do some sourcing on LinkedIn within the team on the business that's going to actually help us to get referrals or maybe promote the role on LinkedIn as people are resharing things? It's kind of all those things that we need up front so the expectations are set very cleanly so that when we actually do execute the search, it doesn't come in dribs and drabs. So we actually have this kind of one big bang launch. Then it's okay, what competencies are actually going to be needed in order to assess whether a candidate's going to be effective? What does the interview plan look like in order to assess those competencies? So, you've got your initial phone screen. What is the recruiter looking for? How do they assess whether to move a candidate forward? And then what does a successful kind of pass-through rate look like at that point so that the hiring managers is not constantly having conversations with people that are not a good fit? How does that feedback loop work? How many hiring manager conversations are expected to generate one on-site interview? What are the competencies assessed in that on-site interview? Who's going to assess those beyond the hiring manager and the recruiter? Do we have buy-in from them? What does the scorecard look like? What is the brief to everyone that's on the interview panel? And then how do we actually have kind of weekly or bi-weekly interview debrief meetings where we're actually going to compare candidates not against each other, but against a standard of expectation that we want for this role so that we can make an effective hiring decision. And it's kind of really I've been through this hundreds of times, so it kind of rolls off the tongue. But how do we go from the right person in the right seat to build the hiring plan and the recruiting process backwards to make sure that when that person does land in the seat, they're the right fit? We've done it effectively. We've kind of moved the best people through the funnel. We've not wasted time, and we actually know exactly what we're looking for. So that was a bit of a monologue because I've delivered this
No,
to
I love it.
probably dozens or hundreds of founders, but that's how I like to approach this.
No, I think from a process perspective, you and I are kind of lasered in. On Unicorn, I have an intake session interview rubric process that covers essentially the same thing. I don't think, Unicorn is a consolidated view of like all TA leader best practices. Like we're not inventing anything by having a good requisition kickoff process. I think what we're doing though is, for this audience especially, it's like recognizing the difference between process theory and real life, right? So like if I'm a hiring manager and I'm doing a repeat role or a backfill, do I need to do an intake session? And the answer could be yes or no, but if so, how do I adjust it? Do I have a 15-minute intake session for something that's never existed before? Do I you need to revisit the job description every time? Who owns the library of these different processes, and how do you manage that as kind of like a system? Because what you're doing is you're extracting information from the business about what to hire, and you're reducing the amount of like mid-funnel drop off because there's a calibration that you should have caught up front. And so, yeah, I think understanding, like, if I'm going to talk to an executive about the requisition kickoff process, I'm starting at this high level of like, hey, here's why we do it, even if the job exists in the first place. And some of those reasons, by the way, like my script for executive reasoning with job kickoff processes, you do job kickoffs to ensure that everyone's on the same page and it improves funnel conversion rates. It's a capacity thing. Two, it's a validation of expectations down to the individual. I say this most for like director level candidates. Ask 10 people what they think the scope of a director is. You can get 10 different answers. And so by aligning on what the scope is, it allows you to do two things. One, target the right person. Right? If I'm a director at GE and then you try to be a director at Headcount 365, those are just two different scopes of work, and they're not, no, it's not the same job at all. So, do the intake session, align across the individuals. It allows you to audit against your leveling framework, your comp framework, what's going on. And then lastly, the idea that the requisition kickoff is kind of setting those expectations and aligning on what the profile is. It allows you then do your calibration or your kind of funnel conversion based on that information. So if that hiring manager wants to know what the blocker is of something, whether it's the recruiting team or the top of funnel, if it's the hiring team and not getting enough interviews or your interview capacity, or if it's the finance slash comp team and you're not having the appropriate dollars to go close the candidate you want, this is going to help them go do that. So those are the things I talk about with an exec from like a requisition kickoff process. But knowing that I need, you know, reasonably 2 weeks before I think I need to kick off the role, time to get all this stuff organized, to get it prepped, approve the job description. I'm setting that time. And then you can pre-schedule those in based on the target start dates of all of your roles on the hiring plan. And it just becomes more planned. And like anything else, if you have a hiring led blocker where someone's not showing up for that, or they don't want to do it, you now have a way to like say, hey, I've set this expectation up front. This manager isn't responding to that type of stuff. So for me, that's requisition kickoffs. I'm not sure I missed anything, but if I didn't, I think what would be helpful for this audience is to describe kind of like, all right, outside of the individual benefits of doing each one of these things, which we covered, what do the peers get? What does the business get? What happens to workforce planning, business planning when you start to do these types of things? I think that's kind of like the nice closer, a nice bow to put on this type of stuff, because it's one thing for 2X recruiting leaders to talk about why to do all these practices. But if I can't explain it to anyone else, I kind of lose that credibility going out and doing this role.
Yeah, you're looking at what's in it for them, the kind of WIFTY acronym of, okay, how do I get the buy-in from the business on this? And you think, what do they actually want from the recruiting team? Well, they want the roles filled quickly, they want visibility, they want the partnership in order to make effective hiring decisions. Because what they don't want to do is hire the wrong person because they were going too fast and then come back 6 months later to hire the same role again. So what they get is they get kind of a very clear process. They get the hire closed as quickly as is reasonably practicable, not as quickly as possible, but you want to balance time, cost, and quality there. And they get a kind of a long-term partnership with the recruiting organization that's going to allow them to be close partners in the future whenever they come to expand their team or think about what's going to happen moving forward. So the business, I think the advantages of buying into this process are very clear. On the recruiting side, you have a more predictable demand forecast, which is going to help you to staff the team more effectively, not get surprised when new recs drop in the funnel that you weren't expecting. And actually for the recruiting leader, that's so important because when they need to report to their executive team, they won't have the credibility to state what they hope to achieve and actually make that believable with the executive team. And so actually having this kind of data-driven plan with the capacity planning tool or with all the additional outputs that we've discussed are actually going to help them to build that credibility, get more done over the long run, get promoted, but really just run a very effective recruiting team. And then I think finance is probably the person hiding in the corner who's trying to make sure that the business stays alive. But really they want a better forecast of what does the actual hiring plan look like in terms of when is cost going to hit the books? How does that kind of play out over the course of the year? year? What is the kind of revenue risk for top line versus kind of bottom line headcount cost risk? And then how do they actually bake that into their model so that when they're going to the board or when they're reporting on investor calls, they can actually believe the numbers that they're sharing because they know that the recruiting organization is delivering according to plan, and they can get kind of early insights when that's not going to happen. That's how I've seen it play out when this is done well across those three teams. Curious, get your take on anything I've missed.
Yeah, I think, to me, I think we talked about this last year as like a plan for the plan, right? So like the hiring plan is what the business wants to do. And then this is the execution plan against it. And the plan for the plan means predictability, proactive predictions of what will actually happen so that the variance between what you thought was going to happen and what actually happened is smaller. And if there is a variance, it's easily identified and explained without it being a kind of finger pointing blame game. And from a finance perspective, if you have a plan that is people to create things, then the timing of those people starting will impact your ability to create things, whether that's revenue, product, whatever. And so if you have a more accurate prediction of whether or not that will come true, then you'll be able to articulate the spend and the spend forecast much more clearly, as well as the revenue or the production forecast more clearly. And then you can operate in a way that's more proactive. The most common example, like if I have a role with a start date in the near future and I haven't begun working on it, that will likely not close. And if you can get to a place where you're predicting how many of those will happen and how backfill is impacting, you're going to have a much tighter forecast that goes all the way up the chain. And so I think from a recruiting perspective, there's a marketing to recruiting teams about the value that they create. And then this to me is the actual operational execution of that value. So I think all recruiting folks intrinsically know that the work we do has this downstream effect of production and revenue, but building a plan for how you're going to create that and proactively identifying the gaps and then making a plan for how to fill those gaps and distributing accountability to different teams will help you kind of deliver um, a package of your value come review time. You'll have credibility in the workforce planning process. When you want to add more recruiters, you will be able to report more strongly about the accountability of production. And ultimately, it leads to promotions for TA leaders. It leads to more efficient teams. And so, these five things: recruiting capacity versus demand, calculating your hiring manager capacity, requisition prioritization process, building a cadence with your managers about how they want to be reported to or how they want to be flagged for different issues, and then setting a process for how recruiting happens and kind of a check and balance on things that are outside of scope. Those five things, I think, create recruiter promotions. They establish credibility with the recruiting leadership team, with the rest of the business. They help finance operate more predictively and more proactively. And they ultimately unify the executive team around how headcount is effectively impacting their ability to hit their goals. And, for me, this is kind of I built a whole business around the idea, like a whole software solution around the idea that having a plan for your plan drives better business outcomes. So obviously I'm very passionate about this, but to me, those are the key benefits of doing a process like this. The second you get your hiring plan, and maybe even a little bit before.
Sounds great. I don't think I can add anything else to that. That'll be great way to wrap it up.
Yeah, look, I think in the world of building any plan, there's always a little bit of reality. We understand that like things that we're talking about today have their nuances of, well, what happens if a recruiter quits, or what happens if we get fundraising, or what happens, yada, 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 right? I think plans can be modified throughout this series of the Headcount Experts. We're going to talk a little bit about how kind of the things that happen during normal parts of the year will impact, this plan will impact the people supply chain. And ultimately, our goal here is to kind of distribute information about how headcount data and headcount best practice can drive value beyond, having a piece of paper or an Excel spreadsheet with all your recs on it. So stay tuned for more episodes. We're excited to bring a lot more of a kind of plan segments, more visuals. If there's something that you're interested in, hit us on the Slack channel or drop a comment below. We're always interested in the feedback from the different listeners about what we could be doing better. And we also look forward to bringing on some cool guests this year to kind of bring some internal insights about some of the topics that we have this year. But thanks for tuning in, headcountexperts.com, and we look forward to connecting with you on the next one.